sustainability is an unresolved kind of problem which has been taken over by climate change scientists and other sort of urgent kind of future disaster predictions, which of course are ultimately very important and we all need to be concerned. But at the same time, it's eclipsing a lot of questions over local life and cultural production. So I think there's an urgent issue there, and it's urgent to address the lack of cultural management and production frameworks that really can provide intellectual leadership in sustainability. Um, and I know, being within the business of running master's degrees for cultural management and policy, that really sustainability doesn't play a big role in throughout Europe, really, in training of cultural managers and producers. And really, it should be a central driving force because it has the kind of power to connect with everything else. I think, as Philippe's talk has shown, the kind of ways in which these connections can be made in very concrete, specific ways, in which you can start to talk about competencies and skills and certain forms of knowledge which are, applicable, and you can apply them without being instrumentalist or without being, instrumentalist in the old arts management sense. So I think there's a great project here, and a very important project, which involves a kind of a research side and a teaching pedagogy side.
I mean, once we start to understand culture as transformative power for sustainability, it's a totally different ballgame from my point of view. And I think that's a challenge, and that's the task, to really try and understand what that means. We start from, let's say, global policy frameworks as a starting point, and then the major question is how to translate that into, what happens at local circumstances or what we do in everyday practices. But maybe it works the other way around. I would advocate that maybe that we would start, by looking what is possible, what can be done, realistically in our everyday practice, and then see how that might diffuse in an organic fashion until it becomes, so to speak, the new norm, and then is translated into is institutionalized, so to speak.
I would say that this is also rediscovering the meaning of cultural management today through the values of sustainability. What is the role of cultural producers today? Not only what they do, how they behave, but how they narrate what they do, how they impact the identification of local communities, how they on which values they are based when they are trying to identify the inhabitants of a local community through the different kind of tools and projects that they are offering. I mean, this is also, I cannot agree more with that this is redefining cultural management through the new values.
As the rector said at the beginning, sustainability has something to do fundamentally with the way we live or the way of life. And so we are faced with a huge challenge of innovating sustainability on the level of global policy discourse, but then having to interpret and translate that into local cultural heritage and local place-based culture and lifestyles and the values of interacting with our material environment. But this is an important challenge, a challenge facing our generation of cultural managers and producers, on how do we reframe, as Marcin put it, reframe cultural management in terms of sustainability. And what does that mean? And it means some basic things to do with the language we use, the values we hold, but particularly the aims of knowledge that we articulate. What are we aiming for as cultural managers, or what should we be prioritizing? Because sustainability is heavily determined by very, very urgent contemporary and future needs, such as climate change and extinction and so on and so on, that we are kind of eclipsing a historicity of human thought, which contains within it some very, very important reference points, particularly for cultural thinkers and policymakers. Now, I'm going to sort of propose to you, I suppose this is my argument for cultural managers wanting to make their management, or rather to frame their management of commissioning and providing space and resources for creative cultural producers. Well, framing your practice with sustainability, I would suggest, is precisely finding that place of tension between the triangulated discourse in which needs, environment, and development are all kind of working towards some unity of sustainability, but not quite getting there. And I take tensions and contradictions very seriously. And I think they're very much part of the spectrum of cognitive practices that we recognize as ideological. And that's important because ideology is fundamental to political thought, and everything should remain political in order to be public, in order to be objects of democratic practice. So I'm sort of setting up this kind of framework as a kind of framework of discourse within which we need, or as cultural managers, need to think sustainability as an unresolved discourse. So I'm just going to sort of leave you with one important kind of way in which art can provide the content for our kind of cultural management narrating, as Martin put it, or framework for sustainability. And that is, you know, the reality of human experience, meaning, and representation of material nature as separate from human nature. That, I think, is still a dilemma within human society. And secondly, of cultural production providing models of sustainable living, such as local supply chains or the design and construction of habitation or dwelling, or the sort of, as one of our earlier contributors, I think it was Philippe or Robert, who said about the fundamental sort of shaping of place and space. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
I would simply want to put forward as a hypothesis a kind of an archetype that could be, so to speak, inspirational for those who are assuming the role of cultural managers in communities. And the archetype I'm actually borrowing from Peter Block, who wrote, amongst other books, the answer to How is Yes and Community, the Structure of Belonging, which are very much worth reading. And the archetype I'm borrowing from him is the social architect. So the social architect. So what I'm proposing as a hypothesis is to see the role of a cultural manager in relationship to that process of social learning as a social architect. And what does a social architect do? Well, it's a person, it's a professional, so to speak, who helps to co-create the conditions for emergence in a particular local setting, in a particular community, by opening up places, settings that encourage, and again, I'm following the lead that is offered by Peter Block, that encourages idealism, i.e. helps, incentivizes people, citizens, members of community to articulate their aspirations and to envision their aspirations for a better future, to make intimacy possible, intimacy being the capacity to engage in an intelligent contact with the world around us, and which is becoming increasingly difficult given, so to speak, the dominance of screen time and quarantines, and depth. You know, the settings that create the demand for depth, which from my point of view is equivalent to reflexivity, our ability to question our own assumptions and indeed engage in the kind of, let's say, semantic and linguistic openness, so to speak, to also, listen to other voices, trying to understand other languages. So that I think that would be, from my point of view, would be the kind of reframing that I alluded to earlier on when we discussed with Katrina, the reframing that I would propose as a potential role for cultural managers. And I think the managerial frame doesn't really help here, if I'm honest. I think that's and I think Marcin would agree with that, hearing what he said earlier. I think indeed the managerial frame pushes us in a particular direction, making us assume that there are resources out there that needs to be marshaled in line with predefined goals. But I mean, given the complexity we are facing, that's obviously not the way it works. So that's why I'm proposing a different archetype: social architect, as an architect, as a person who actually designs, creates, curates particular spaces in which something can happen, in which something can emerge.
Even in our current modern world, where we are more and more mobile, and we still have a connection or connections to places, and that's a kind of resource for being a human, and also where we start from, also in sustainability transformation. So we cannot escape the place relation, although those relations are very different from what we used to have in the past, where people were more rooted in one place. So place is very important, and also the cultural heritage is, to my understanding, important part often of this place attachment or sense of place.
And so there's been a kind of a breaking down of barriers between institutionalized fine arts and the market and local urban and social development. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, but I think that's very, very positive. And I think now it's possible to make connections between local people, local development, and high-level contemporary artistic practice with artists and architects and designers and, all kind of musical composers. But there's just a huge need for the kinds of cultural managers and producers that can do that. Because the kinds of courses that train cultural managers are still based really on the institutionalized fine arts or community arts in an old-fashioned sense. But there are now, and this is why Marcin's doing a great thing in just moving beyond that. So we have a new way of integrating the local and the international and local development with high-level contemporary practice.
And I started to think about this. Should we start from the practice, as some speakers were saying, or the philosophy, and how? Because I think art as very ethical field and very practice-based field also. I'm a sculptor myself, so it's really practice-based. So I think I'm not an expert in sustainability questions in other areas, but I think in the area of art, this kind of practice-based, of course we need writing and philosophies and things like that, but I really feel this practice-based approach and these social architects, and I find very interesting this area for art between needs, environment and development.
If we assume that in the urban context or in the local context, empowerment of citizens, participation of participants, I think Katrina mentioned lifestyles. If these things play an important role, it is clear that place attachment and local and regional identity are important or pre-condition for something like local sustainability. And here cultural identity, material cultural identity, but also immaterial heritage, cultural heritage plays an important role.
I mean, given your very laudable and very clear mission to create more equal societies by developing competencies that unify people, and given the potential that is there to tie up, to connect, on the one hand, arts and cultural management, however we understand it, community education, and professionals that contribute to all kinds of literacy, I think there is an enormous potential to develop very, very strong and powerful synergies between these three areas in your research and in your teaching. So I would incentivize you to do that.
I feel that I have been in a washing machine and the engine was on. So there are very, very many refreshing ideas and thoughts, and we started to plan this COSM all together with this idea that we are looking for ways to look outside the box of this box of cultural management or whatever that means. And so I think that we have started something, a good journey, and we have a lot of food to carry on. And I appreciate a lot about this for presentation, and I think that we managed to build up different kind of 4 different areas. It's first we started with the culture, with this mental maps of culture, and then then we moved to space ideology and dimensions, talked about the different dimensions of space, and then again art as a tool for dialogue, and in the end about this question of social architect as a role, maybe a role for a future cultural manager, and so I did like that idea of social architect also very much, because it covers so much what has been recently going on in a big debate of cultural and arts manager, and what is the role of manager and management altogether in our present societies. So I think that in the end, a couple of years ago, we arranged seminars where we started to have a discussion of what is the ideology, what is the identity of cultural management as a discipline. And of course, you can expect that we never find out what was the real identity of cultural management. Maybe it hasn't that. But what is good with cultural management as a field, as an academic field, is that it's open to different directions. And that's a good starting point for a academic field, also for a future academic field. And I think that's one of the things that keeps me going anyway, and be interested in cultural management as an academic field, because it doesn't close so many doors. It's usually open up some doors, and well, its problem is that sometimes there are moments when it's too windy, too many windows open and too many close open, but then you have just to find out how to go with this kind of storms. But thank you very much. I think this is a good starting point, and we will certainly continue with COSM talks, and you gave us a lot of energy to do this forward.
I mean, we have several concepts, also including the one that was mentioned by Philippe, the other one with idealism, intimacy, and depth that we have to frame as cultural managers, and also another triangle by Jonathan, that the question of a triangle of need, material environment, and development, which is another concept that we might rethink how we can respond to that as cultural managers, cultural curators or producers, how to frame that keep it as a kind of ideological background in a way, but produce very practical and very tools-oriented solutions, I would say, for people from cultural sector. Keeping in mind these, I'd say, profound dimensions that you enriched us with in your speeches. And also I would like to refer to Katrina points about bridging between the sectors, which is taking place right now here, but also that we have to take further in our activities. And we are going to do that through the kind of COSM educational courses that are going to be offered in cooperation with independent organizations and also outsiders from university who are our former alumni or who are representatives of different sectors, mostly a creative sector, but not only, to also exemplify and also to apply some kind of ideas we would like to support our students and future professionals with.